Hi, everyone. My name is Neha Srinivasan, and I am a senior here at HLS from Louisville, Kentucky. In May, I will graduate with a Bachelor of Science in International Studies with a minor of Business, as well as a Bachelor of Arts in Spanish. I've been honored to call Hamilton Lugar my home for the past few years. During my time at IU, I've had the privilege of serving the university and my peers in several capacities. As a freshman and sophomore, I served on the Undergraduate Chair Advisory Board at the Kelley School of Business, and I am currently serving my second term on the Global Student 7, which is the student advisory board to Ambassador Lee Feinstein of the Hamilton Lugar School. The other board members and I have had the distinct honor of observing firsthand the love and dedication that Ambassador Feinstein has for the school, his students, and the campus at large. I have also had the opportunity to serve on the 98th Board of EONS, which is the Student Research and Advisory Board to President Michael McRobbie. In my future career, I hope to embody the service-oriented mindset and the globally astute abilities exemplified not only by Ambassador Feinstein and President McRobbie, but also Congressman Lee Hamilton. Congressman Hamilton, along with the late Senator Richard Lugar, is more than the namesake of our school. He's the founding spirit. Congressman Hamilton represented Indiana's 9th District from 1965 to 1999, where he was committed to U.S. global leadership, prudent about the application of American power around the world, and an exemplar of Congress, carrying out its constitutional role in foreign policy. The congressman served as chair and ranking member of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, vice chair of the 9/11 Commission, and co-chair of the bipartisan Iraq Study Group. In 2015, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom and remains one of the nation's foremost experts on Congress and representative democracy. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Lee Hamilton.
I always hate following these students because they do such a good job, don't they? She's just terrific. Thank you for your gracious introduction. I used to attend conferences on the U.S. role in the world for decades. I traveled up and down the East Coast to go to those conference meetings. Washington, New York, Boston, New Haven. Something's in New Haven, I can't remember what the school is. Cambridge, can't remember that either. And today we're in Bloomington, Indiana. Wow. That's what I call progress. And we're, of course, delighted to see you all. I come with the view that this conference is probably the most important conference taking place in this country today and probably for months past. The U.S. role in the world. And I must say, I have never, ever in any conference seen such a terrific group of panelists as we've had here. Just exceptionally talented and articulate. And every time I listened to them, I said, boy, I'm glad I'm not on the stage with that person. But they were really good, and we appreciate the quality of their participation. Now, arranging a conference like this is not easy. It takes a village. It takes a lot of talented people. And those people have been coordinated by Lee Feinstein. The dean has done a wonderful job in arranging, he and his colleagues, in arranging this conference. And if you have an opportunity, I hope you'll express to him your appreciation for what he and they have done. But of course, the leadership starts at the top. And President McRobbie and Provost Lauren Rebel have just been marvelous in their support of this conference. We're honored today to have the First Lady of Indiana University with us, and I'll have Laura stand up, if you would, so that she may be greeted. They asked me whether Michael or she should come. I said I prefer her. Now, don't tell Michael that when he walks in. We're delighted to have you and look forward. He's going to join us shortly. Now, this is the first conference without Dick Lugar. I miss Dick. I like the way he approached things. He was very pragmatic. He was always very cooperative. He wanted to know how to solve the problem and to advance toward that solution as best we could under the circumstances. He and I worked together for over 5 decades, both in the Congress and on all kinds of boards and commissions. I cannot remember a single time when we disagreed. We sat on dozens and dozens of conference committees. All you do is argue in a conference committee. He and I were on the same side. Now, of course, he's not here to defend himself, so I can say anything I damn please. But I think that's reasonably accurate. And it's understandable. We both believed in U.S. leadership in the world. We both believed in what that role should be, approximately. We agreed on what the threats were. And again, we reinforced one another as we went through these different meetings. So I'm delighted to have my name with his in the name of this school. Now, before introducing Ambassador Burns and Susan Glasser, which I'll get to with pleasure in a moment, but I want to talk a little bit. Maybe for quite a while, actually. I don't know. No, I won't be long. I want to say a few words about the importance of the world Ambassador Burns comes from. Diplomacy, the world of diplomacy. Diplomacy is the first tool of American foreign policy. Churchill said it correctly. It's better to jaw than war, war, war. That's it in a nutshell. Incidentally, as I have listened to these panels over the past few hours, I've been impressed again and again with how often they have mentioned the word diplomacy. Diplomacy, we must not be starry-eyed about it, about what it can achieve. It is not a panacea. It does not make the world's problems go away. It does not always work. And in a tough world, it has to be supported by all of the tools of American power, including economic leverage and military force, and supported also by highly skilled diplomats. That said, not engaging in diplomacy comes with a near guarantee that our world's problems will fester, risks will rise, and we will miss opportunities to advance our interests. Diplomacy requires adherence to principles. It also requires compromise. And that often calls for an elusive balance to be struck, one that many people have a hard time understanding. The day has passed, if it ever was, when the U.S. could dictate any outcome we want. But skillful diplomacy can often get most, if not all, of what we want. In the century unfolding before us, we have to navigate a crowded, complicated, and competitive world. You've heard a lot about that in the last few hours. We need all the talent we can muster in both the private and the public sectors to survive and prosper. That means the strongest military forces, the most skillful diplomatic corps, and the most talented private sector entrepreneurs. One of the reasons you and I are optimistic about these matters, I think, if I can be presumptuous enough to try to speak for you, is that we are so impressed with the young people, the students here at this school, across this campus, across this state, and across this nation. And I hope the young people in the audience recognize that with all of the problems that cascade upon us, we need your talent, we need your skill in the years ahead. And I hope that many of you will begin to plan now about ways that you can contribute to the solution of our problems. Any U.S. policymaker understands that our military, diplomatic, and entrepreneurial capabilities make those across the table from us pay attention and respect us. In such a world, we need to understand and appreciate the work of diplomats like Bill Burns. I'm finally getting around to the introduction. Several of you almost got up and walked out, I know that. You can't kid me. Unless I think of something else I want to say. He's the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He served 5 presidents, 10 secretaries of state from both parties. He served as U.S. Deputy Secretary of State, Ambassador to Russia and Jordan, and many other high-level posts in the federal government and in the Department of State specifically. He is the recipient of 3 Presidential Distinguished Service Awards and has received the highest civilian honor from the Department of Defense. In 2013, Foreign Policy magazine named him Diplomat of the Year. He is a graduate of LaSalle University, has earned master's and doctorate degrees from Oxford, and during his 33 years as a career diplomat, he achieved the highest rank in the Foreign Service, Career Ambassador, and became only the 2nd serving career diplomat to become Deputy Secretary of State. He is a superb example of our diplomatic corps. You and I may not know their names. They often work behind closed doors, but we owe a lot to them. These people are talented, committed, effective, patriotic, professional. They soften tensions, reduce conflicts, solve problems, build alliances and partnerships, and limit the effectiveness of our adversaries. Now, Mr. Burns understands, I'm sure, that in the nation's heartland, of which Indiana is an important part, federal bureaucrats are not always met with unstinted praise. Mr. Secretary, I'm going to put this as gently as I can. And so for coming here, I commend Ambassador Burns for his courage. I'm quite confident that his remarks will boost our confidence in our bureaucrats. We are pleased to have him in Indiana, and specifically at the school at Indiana University, the School of Global and International Affairs Studies. We're also delighted to have with us Susan B. Glasser. She will have a moderated discussion very shortly, as soon as I sit down, actually. Well, that could be a while, I don't know. She's a staff writer at the New Yorker. Now, boy, you got to be in the elite to read the New Yorker. The articles are too long for me. I can't get through them. No, it's an excellent magazine. She's a staff writer there. She writes a column, a weekly column on life in Trump's Washington. I suspect she has no shortage of material. She's been an editor of several Washington publications, including the award-winning magazines Politico and Foreign Policy. Foreign Policy won 3 national awards during her tenure. For a decade, she worked at the Washington Post, and for part of that time was editor of the Outlook and National News. She spent 4 years as the Post Moscow co-bureau chief, has covered wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. She's the author of a book, which she co-wrote with her husband, Peter Baker, on Putin's Russia. And she will publish a biography, I think she told me a moment ago, of May 5th, is that right? Have I got that right? Now jot this down. What's the title of it?
The Man Who Ran Washington.
What?
The Man Who Ran Washington. The Man Who Ran Washington, the life and times of Jim Baker.
Buy it. I don't fool around, I get right to the core. I couldn't understand them, that's how, it's bad hearing at my age. But I know the point, and that's you go buy the book. She also wrote with her husband, and is writing, I guess, a biography of Secretary of State Jim Baker. She's a distinguished journalist of the highest professional skills. She makes Washington known to the country and the country known to Washington. We invite them now to join us. Please.
I'm bringing you on a picture with me.
Thanks so much. It's really fun to be.
Well, what a fantastic introduction, really. We're so honored to be here with the Congressman. And as you can see, I'm going to be bringing him on book tour with me. He'll cut right to the chase. No, seriously, it is a great honor. And for those of us in Washington who pay attention to foreign policy, the answer to an invitation to have a conversation with Ambassador Burns, there's only one answer to that, and the answer is yes. It's an honor to be with him, and since he is a diplomat's diplomat, I will perform the role of Congressman Hamilton and flack for his book, which is out there and you should all read. But really, I think his book is called The Back Channel, A Memoir of American Diplomacy and the Case for Its Renewal. And the reason I'm starting out with that is because there are actually very few really great books that tell you about diplomacy and how it's been practiced by the U.S. Foreign Service over the last few decades. And that's the truth. There's plenty of textbooks. I'm sure some of you have delved deep in them. But this is a book that manages both to be consummately readable and insightful. And it actually tells you something that probably seems a lot more urgent now than when you started the project.
Yeah, that's an understatement.
Yeah, that's right. So I have had the privilege of knowing Ambassador Burns for some time because he was the ambassador to Russia who came right after my husband and I left Washington, which was really at the very beginning of the Putin era. And certainly had you asked either one of us, would Vladimir Putin be the longest serving leader of Russia since Joseph Stalin, we probably wouldn't have said yes at that moment. But I've known Ambassador Burns for a long time, and he really is a consummate diplomat, which is actually why I'm going to read you this headline to begin our conversation, because it tells you a lot about where things are right now. This is an article that Ambassador Burns wrote in Foreign Affairs last fall, October 14th. The demolition of U.S. diplomacy. Not since Joe McCarthy has the State Department suffered such a devastating blow. So, in this overheated age, you might not even think, well, that doesn't sound, there's no exclamation points, there's no nasty nicknames. To anyone who knows Bill Burns, that's basically the equivalent of a 5-alarm fire. I wish when I was covering the State Department that you had talked in such terms, but this is not a person who is given to making Joe McCarthy comparisons or to telling us that the sky is falling. So the sky is falling. What made you write that article? And is it too late? Is the house already burned down?
Well, first, it's great to be with you. I mean, you know how much respect I have for you over the years as a journalist. And it's wonderful to be here at the Hamilton Lugar School too. In all the 3.5 decades I spent proudly as a professional American diplomat, Lee Hamilton and Dick Lugar, for me, embodied the absolute best in American public service, and their skill, their decency, their integrity, their capacity to actually get things done, their capacity to always see the national interest, not just the partisan interest, something that's kind of an unnatural act in Washington today, deeply impressed me. So it's wonderful to be here. I'm not, Susan, as you said, by nature an alarmist, but I've been deeply concerned over the last 3 years about the hollowing out of my old institution, the Department of State and of American diplomacy, and concerned in large part because this is a moment on the international landscape, as Congressman Hamilton just said, where actually we need diplomacy more than ever. We're no longer the only big kid on the geopolitical block with the rise of China, given the complexity of the big overarching global challenges, especially climate change. You need to work with other countries. You need to help shape rules. And, to be effective, American diplomacy obviously needs military leverage, economic leverage. But what sets us apart from lonelier powers like China and Russia is our capacity to invest in alliances, to mobilize coalitions of countries, to help shape rules and adapt institutions. And that's what I worry that we're squandering. And, if you just look at the tangible as well as the intangible measures, you look at the State Department today and the sidelining of career expertise. There are 28 so-called Assistant Secretary of State positions in the State Department. These are the senior jobs around which American foreign policy is organized. Today, there's only one of those 28 positions that's held by a career officer confirmed by the US Senate. There's a record number of political appointees in ambassadorial positions.
And many of them are empty.
Many of them are empty today, and this is more than 3 years into an administration. There is a pernicious practice of going after individual career officers just because they worked on controversial issues in the last administration. Over the course of my nearly 3.5 decades as a Foreign Service officer, we made painfully slow progress toward creating a diplomatic service that looks more like the society we represent. When I came into the Foreign Service at the beginning of 1982, most American diplomats looked like me. 9 out of 10 were white, only 1 in 4 were women. We made progress, way too slow, but most of that has been reversed over the course of the last 3 years. And not least, you've had an almost 40% drop in the number of young people applying to join the Foreign Service. Those are the tangible measures. The intangible ones, I think, are just as worrisome to me. When President Trump was asked about 2 years ago whether he was concerned about all those senior vacancies, he said, not really, because I'm the only one who matters. That, in my experience, is diplomacy as an exercise in narcissism. That's not the diplomacy I learned from Jim Baker, as a young diplomat, more than 30 years ago. And then you have, it's wonderful that you're having Ambassador Yovanovitch here to honor her tomorrow at the conference. I had the privilege of serving with her over a number of years, including in Moscow in the early 1990s. But the failure of the leadership of the State Department to stand up for its people in the face of unfair criticism, I think is really unforgivable. So those are among the reasons that I wrote that piece.
Well, and actually, Ambassador Yovanovitch, it was just announced this week, is going to go work at Carnegie now, which you head, which I think will be a big addition. But this goes to a question that's been much debated, really, in Washington over the last few years, which is, what's the right response to this? Is it to stick it out, even in the face of growing adversity? Or will everyone become a refugee in think tank land?
Right. No, it's a really good question because any disciplined service, whether it's the U.S. military or civilian services like the Foreign Service, requires just that. You have to be disciplined. You disagree with a policy, you don't get to run off and complain publicly about it. I had huge admiration for those of my colleagues over the course of my career who resigned because they could not in good conscience support a policy that they thought was wrong. There were about 24 of my colleagues over the crisis in the Balkans in the early 1990s who resigned. There were 3 over the war in Iraq in 2003. But it is equally honorable, in my view, to serve within a system, within the discipline of the system. And it's sort of like the US military. If you're a battalion commander in the Army and you get a lawful instruction to turn right, you don't get to turn left just because you feel like it. But you do have an obligation, especially in the diplomatic service, to be honest when you have concerns. And that's exactly what Masha Yovanovitch did when she was the ambassador in Ukraine. She saw obvious evidence of the use of the tools of American national power to promote what Fiona Hill and other of my former colleagues who testified called domestic political errands. Efforts to promote a partisan interest above the national interest. And she was willing to speak up for that, again, within the discipline of the system. The price she paid for that was being pushed out of that job. And that's the kind of thing that hollows out an institution, especially when there's no defense of that, on the part of the leadership.
Well, that's right. So you have the title, as the congressman pointed out, of career ambassador, which I believe you have to be 3 different times an ambassador in order to have that. There's been an exodus of those people right now. There's probably fewer of those than there have been in modern times. So the hollowing out is not just... It's at every level. Right?
You do, and that's the most worrisome thing for any institution. I talked about the decline in the number of people applying to the Foreign Service. And don't get me wrong, I'm a huge enthusiast for my former profession. And for students in this audience, those I talked to at lunch, I think it is a remarkable profession and, filled with remarkable people. This isn't going to last forever. There's going to be a huge opportunity to help renew that institution as well. But you're losing people at the front end, at the more junior end, and at the senior end, where you have people who either pushed out or, decide to leave because they can't, in good conscience, support policies and or approach to policies that they can't stomach. But then at the mid-level, too, people who've been serving 14, 15 years, you see people getting disenchanted as well. And that's what guts an institution, when you have losses at every level as well. So I think there's a lot at stake today. There's a lot at stake for American interests on a very complicated international landscape. And in some ways, more than at any other time over the course of my own career, diplomacy matters. And yet I see it as more adrift today than I ever saw it before.
Well, you talk about conscience. You write in your book about, probably the issue that tested you the most personally, which was the question of the Iraq War and what your responsibility was, having a sense as someone who had spent much of his career that wasn't focused on Russia and the former Soviet Union. The Middle East was your subject matter. You knew this issue better than anybody, and you were in a position to watch what was happening in the run-up of the Iraq War. Was it a mistake not to have resigned over that?
It's a really good question, Susan, and to this day, to be honest with you, I'm not sure that I got it right. I was running the Middle East Bureau in the State Department for Colin Powell, who was then the Secretary of State, in the run-up to the war in Iraq in 2003. And like virtually all of my colleagues in the Near East Bureau of the State Department who had served in the Middle East and understood the dangers and the second and third consequences of, walking into the middle of sectarian conflicts, we worried deeply about what we saw to be a rush to war. I remember the most depressing brainstorming session of my long career was one afternoon, summer of 2002, when a couple of colleagues of mine and I, one of them, Ryan Crocker, who was a wonderful ambassador, served in the hardest places the United States, has embassies around the world. We sat down and tried to list all the things we thought could go wrong after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. So we weren't taking for granted the military challenge, but what we were worried about is what would happen when you took the deeply repressive lid off that society. We ended up, after a few hours with 11 single-spaced pages and a memorandum we called The Perfect Storm, and that kind of reflected our concern. But to this day, I'm not convinced that I got it right, because what we did was an honest effort. And I reread it recently. We got it about half right. We missed some things. We got others, I think, more or less accurately. But what I didn't offer was a compelling case for an alternative of containing Saddam Hussein, especially in that period after 9/11. When there was this huge outpouring of sympathy from, an unlikely set of bedfellows around the world. Vladimir Putin was, the first world leader to call, George W. Bush in that time as well. And so I'm not sure I got it right. I'm not sure I made the right decision. All I can say is that, my colleagues and I did try to be honest about our concerns.
Do you think that, that was a very divided time, although in some ways it was only after the fact that the Iraq War became as divisive as is probably remembered here. But, when you look at what's happening in Washington right now, and you think back to other, very partisan periods, George W. Bush, would he have ever accused you of being disloyal for disagreeing with the war in Iraq?
No. There might have been some people in that administration who would have, but not President Bush, I don't think. No. This is a different era than any that I experienced, and it certainly keeps my nostalgia under control for public service sometimes. But I do worry about what we're doing to ourselves as well.
Is there such a thing as the deep state? Did you ever hear this term before the last couple of years?
Oh, not about the United States.
It was
you hear
Turkey
about
is when
Turkey
you heard
and
it,
other places. No, and I think, especially with regard to the State Department, that's a crock, to put it diplomatically. I mean, if anything, the State Department, myself included, people are almost loyal to a fault. They're looking for not only clear guidance, instruction, direction, they want their expertise to be taken into account. And it's not like, career public servants like me have a monopoly on wisdom. I got a lot of things wrong over the course of my career. But it makes sense to pay attention to expertise, to people who have gone through issues before. And that's, again, another of the things that I worry about today. So, very early in my career, and this is also to tout the wonderful book that you and Peter are about to publish, I was spoiled in a sense because, I'd been in the Foreign Service less than 10 years, and I worked on the staff of Secretary of State Baker in the George H.W. Bush administration. And here was a moment where you had an intersection of transformative international events. One of those plastic moments that comes along once or twice a century with the end of the Cold War, but intersecting with a group of statesmen, starting with President Bush 41, Jim Baker as the Secretary of State, Brent Scowcroft, the National Security Advisor, a group of people who disagreed sometimes with one another, which is a healthy thing, but understood very clearly the discipline of applying American power. They understood a sense of strategic purpose. They knew this moment of singular American dominance with the collapse of the Soviet Union wasn't a permanent condition. And you had to use that to help shape an international order that would serve our interests long after that moment of singular dominance ended. They had a sense of strategic empathy, too, which is different than sympathy, in foreign policy, but empathy in the sense of being able to put themselves in someone else's shoes, whether it was Mikhail Gorbachev, the beleaguered leader of the Soviet Union as his country was collapsing around him. You didn't see Bush and Baker dancing on the Berlin Wall.
And they were criticized for that.
They were, but they also had, in addition to that empathy, they weren't spiking the football, at the end of a victorious game. They had a sense of strategic discipline, too, of matching ends to means. They were also criticized at the end of the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein's forces had been pushed out of Kuwait, for not doing what would have been, in a way, the easiest thing militarily in the world, was to pursue the Iraqi army all the way to Baghdad and overthrow Saddam Hussein. That was a hard call to make, because it did seem to be a very easy and almost logical thing to do. But I remember listening to Baker the afternoon that decision was made. And he and President Bush and Brent Scowcroft, I think, understood very clearly the coalition that they had put together so painstakingly was going to collapse. If we overreached in that sense. Second, they understood what this moment was like with the end of the Soviet Union about to occur, that they wanted to invest in that moment and not take any chances with international order. And Baker also had in mind already the idea of using this military victory to make diplomatic progress in the long-running conflict between Arabs and Israelis. And not least, they also understood in a way that 10 years later, the American administration did not understand the complexities of the day after in Iraq. And so I saw that as a sign of strategic discipline, which is something I learned very early on in my career, but which always impressed me.
Well, it's interesting. So you did work with 10 different secretaries of state, and clearly you and I have had a number of conversations about Secretary Baker, who is high on the list. What is the range that you've seen? Is there a partisan difference between Democrats and Republicans? Are there approaches that are more or less successful? And where do you think the current two secretaries of state, where would they fall on that list?
Yeah, I have admiration for all 10 of the secretaries that I worked for. Baker was particularly impressive. He was a wonderful negotiator. I look at, the sort of current negotiating approach of this White House, and it's like night and day compared to what I saw Baker do. That was the real art of the deal, in a sense, too. Baker, whether it was...
He hasn't read our book yet, but that's in there.
Yeah, well, no, but that was always most impressive. Now, granted, as I mentioned before, in the Bush 41 administration, Bush and Baker had a stronger hand to play than any of their successors have had. And that's not a small thing. But what I worry about today is that in the kind of blustery unilateralism of this administration, if you listen to the president, it's almost like, we're Gulliver and we're tied down by the Lilliputians, our allies, our partners, international institutions, and the best way to apply American power and promote American interest is to break all those bonds. I think we have that backwards. I think this is a moment when having company on the takeoff on big international problems makes a big difference on the landing, because even though there's no substitute for disciplined American leadership and moving people in a direction, it helps to have company too. And so that's what I worry about most in the approach, I think, of this administration. You see, you see issues that I think are where the administration takes a quite sensible approach. It does make sense to push back against predatory Chinese trade and investment practices. It does make sense to try to end what is almost a 2-decade-long war in Afghanistan. The problem, though, is how you do it. I mean, pushing back against Chinese trade and investment practices, logically, you would want to make common cause with other players who share those same concerns, whether it's Japan or the European Union, and instead, we start second and third front trade conflicts with them. So that's where I see a pretty significant departure from the experience in both Democratic and Republican administrations that I served before.
Yeah, there's somewhat of a debate in Washington these days. You'll hear some people say, well, actually Trump and Obama both had similar impulses when it came to, looking inward in the United States. They both were critical of Europe and its refusal to sort of take more responsibility for its own security policy. I'm wondering where you fall down on that. I mean, obviously, Obama had a very different response to those.
Well, I mean, first, it's really the last 4 American presidents going back to Clinton that if you look at the campaign rhetoric, and they came into office talking about, the importance, the primacy of nation building at home. That makes a certain amount of sense given all the huge challenges that, all of us know very well today of inequalities, of, infrastructure, of immigration, of all sorts of problems. But, they all learned one way or the other that you couldn't disengage from the world. And so I think you're right, Susan, both, if you look back to 2009 with President Obama, you look at 2017 with President Trump, their diagnosis of the problem was similar in some ways, that we needed to find a way to better balance our priorities at home with our engagement overseas, that we did need to shift the terms of our engagement, both with adversaries and with allies. So we needed to push some of our most important NATO allies to spend more on defense. That makes sense. But what I worry about, again, is it's not so much the diagnosis, it's the prescription. Because there, I think, you see a pretty significant departure.
For Obama, led you into secret talks with Iran, and with Trump, it led him to blow up the result of those secret talks. Right,
and I led the secret nuclear talks with the Iranians through all of 2013. I would be the last person to argue that either the interim agreement we reached at the end of 2013, which froze and rolled back the Iranian nuclear program, or eventually the comprehensive nuclear agreement a year and a half later, were perfect agreements. But perfect is really on the menu in diplomacy. Those agreements were meant to be the beginning of diplomacy, not the end of it. Like arms control with the old Soviet Union, you do one agreement and then you improve upon it over time. You do an agreement to limit one set of insecurities, an unconstrained Iranian nuclear program, to prevent them from developing a nuclear weapon. But at the same time, you push back against other elements of the behavior of the Iranian regime which threaten our interests in important ways and threaten the interests of our friends. I think it was a foolish mistake, for the Trump administration to walk away from that agreement in May of 2018. The president said at the time he wanted a better nuclear deal. Well, you fast forward to today, and we not only don't have a better deal, we don't have any nuclear deal with the Iranians. They're edging further and further away from compliance with the agreement. They've already amassed a stockpile of enriched material that puts us back almost to where we were several years ago as well. And it increases the possibility of collisions in a part of the world where there's already more than its share of insecurities. And so, I think what the administration has done through what it calls maximum pressure is inflict enormous damage on the Iranian economy. And we're capable of doing that, and I'm the last person to argue that you don't need economic leverage in diplomacy. You need that. But if maximum pressure is not tethered to realistic objectives, you're setting yourself up for trouble. If what you're applying is a form of, what people in the State Department call coercive diplomacy, and it's all coercion and no diplomacy, you're asking for trouble over time. And you're also deepening the rift with some of our closest European allies who still want to stay in this agreement, in a sense doing Vladimir Putin's work for him.
So if I could commission you to write a modern day follow-up to your Perfect Storm memo, and it was looking ahead at American foreign policy over the next few years, let's just say that Donald Trump is reelected, he has said, as you already pointed out, I'm the only one who matters in foreign policy. So what are some of the possibilities that would land on your single space list this time?
Well, I mean, I'll start with the general and then get to the specific. I mean, broadly speaking, you're already seeing a situation where allies are losing faith and they start to hedge, where adversaries and rivals take advantage, not just China, but Russia and then regional adversaries as well. The institutions that we worked very hard over 70 years to help shape, the rules of the road internationally, are starting to teeter as well. And then, we're corroding the institutions that we depend upon to navigate successfully in foreign policy. So those are all the broad disturbing indicators. Specifically, I think, you set yourself up for a lot of problems. I mean, starting in Asia, I think competition with China is going to be the most important element of American strategy on the international landscape for this administration, for whatever happens after 2021 and for many years into the future. But managing that competition is going to be enormously important. And I think that's going to require a kind of consistency of purpose you don't always see with this administration. North Korea, I've never taken issue with, the president's instinct, which was to deal directly with Kim Jong-un, the impulsive and young leader of North Korea. I couldn't point to a pristine record of American diplomacy in dealing with North Korea over the previous 30 years. But I think it's a mistake to think that ingratiating yourself with an authoritarian foreign leader is going to produce neat, positive results. I mean, you remember, and no amount of love letters is going to produce that, because you look at the record of, the last 3 years, what Kim Jong-un has continued to do, is show no evidence he's interested in fully denuclearizing. He's expanded his nuclear program. He's continued to build his missile program as well. Similarly, some of you may remember, when President Trump met President Putin in Helsinki in the summer of 2018. And on the stage publicly, he essentially threw 17 US intelligence and law enforcement agencies under the bus. He said he trusted Putin's instinct about whether Russia had interfered in our 2016 election or not. My view is if you could have seen the cartoon balloon coming out of Putin's head on that stage, it would have read, "What an easy mark." Because from his point of view, efforts to ingratiate are signs of weakness and manipulability. And Putin is someone who's professionally trained to look for those vulnerabilities.
So let me press you though. So, okay, in our hypothetical second term then, Trump unconstrained, he's already been impeached once and survived it, so he thinks it's a superpower now. He doesn't face the voters. He has cycled through so much staff. I read this week, actually, the latest number is 82% turnover in his top staff, according to Brookings, in the 3 years, 82%. But so he's cycled through and he's found staff that are willing to do what he wants and not impose their own agenda. So Vladimir Putin, we hold a signing ceremony to give him title to Crimea forever in perpetuity. We lift the sanctions. We kick American troops out of South Korea. We make Japan pay us, and then we give them a nuclear weapon.
I think just to go through some of the specific issues you raised, Susan, I think there's a danger in South Korea. You've already seen the president basically trying to turn the U.S. military presence in South Korea into a protection racket, where we're kind of renting out the U.S. military. Of course, it's true that South Korea should spend significantly, not only on its own defense, but supporting an American, military contribution to that defense. The same is true in Japan. But what the president has done is raise the basic question of whether we really need those alliances anymore, too. So there is a danger, if there is to be a second term, that you'd see not just erosion, but the collapse of some of those alliances. There's a danger, I think, in terms of NATO, that you could see, in a fit of pique, a president who decides this isn't worth it anymore, too. With regard to Putin's Russia, there are some constraints, notably the US Congress, on sort of what you can do with regard to sanctions and lifting them unilaterally. But, American presidents, we always tell ourselves that there are checks and balances, there are constraints. That applies in domestic policy, although a lot of those have been eroded in the last 3 years. In foreign policy, American presidents still have an awful lot of latitude as well. So I would worry about those issues as well. I worry about the Middle East, not just the dangers of a collision involving Iran policy, in which I think everybody suffers in different ways. I worry about our indulgence of some of our closest Gulf Arab allies, like Saudi Arabia, under Mohammed bin Salman. There's a reason we should be supportive of Saudi Arabia in terms of serious efforts at social and economic modernization, which are overdue. Saudi Arabia faces legitimate external threats. There's a good argument for the United States being supportive of Saudi Arabia. But where you have overreach on the part of this impulsive young leader, whether it's the catastrophe that's going on in Yemen today, or it's the overreach in murdering a very mild-mannered Saudi dissident in a Saudi diplomatic facility in Istanbul, and then dismembering him, that's the kind of thing that you have to call someone on. And instead, I think we've tended to check our values at the door in those relationships. You need to make those relationships a two-way street, is my only argument. And I think we've made too many of them one-way streets.
I want to make sure I get to questions. So I believe that we have microphones in the room. I'm going to ask a moderator's prerogative here while you're getting your questions ready. And we've obviously talked a lot, understandably, about the Trump administration.
Yes.
We don't know yet, although this has been quite a remarkable week in American politics, where the Democratic field will end up. They haven't talked a lot about foreign policy, except to say they're against endless wars, which we all know is a pretty easy thing to be against and a pretty hard thing to do something about. But I want to ask you specifically about Joe Biden, who you worked with, of course, during the 8 years of the Obama presidency. Vice President Biden knows the international order very well, and he was the Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman before he was vice president. At the same time, I was, and I think you were as well, in Munich last year when at the Munich Security Conference, he gave essentially his foreign policy manifesto for the campaign he then launched soon thereafter. And, it's pretty simple. It's, hey, world, we'll be back. Hold your breath as long as you can, and don't worry, America will be on its white horse soon. Just, let's get our act together and then we're going to come back. I want to ask you about that. Is that a realistic foreign policy? Can we snap back to the status quo ante? Is November 5th, 2016 ever going to reappear on our horizon?
Yeah, no, the world's changing. The landscape is changing. I have huge admiration for Vice President Biden, and I think that the first step, the starting point, is actually to come back in the sense of, resuming a disciplined, predictable leadership role in the world. I think that's really important, and I think he's right. But I also think that the landscape is shifting. As I mentioned before, we're no longer the only big kid on the geopolitical block. We still have a better hand to play than any of our major rivals do as I look at over the next couple of decades, but we're going to have to adapt. So Asia is becoming increasingly the center of gravity, geoeconomically and geopolitically. We're going to have to work even harder to take advantage of our biggest assets, which are partners and allies and an ability to shape rules across Asia. You want to affect the incentives and the disincentives of the current Chinese leadership, which is not 10 feet tall. You watched the difficulties they're having in dealing with the coronavirus. They're going to be a formidable competitor, but we have a lot of assets out there. But the next step beyond just coming back and asserting ourselves in a disciplined way is going to be to begin to adapt our approach to different parts of the world. It means that the transatlantic relationship between us and our European allies is going to remain very important, but it's going to be different. It needs to be different in the sense that some of our European partners are going to need to step up more, be willing to take more initiative, take more risk. But we're going to have to adapt too. We're not going to be able to be as patronizing as we've often been in assuming that they need to do more, but we get to call all the shots. So that'll shift. We need to shift the terms of our engagement in the Middle East, which is not the same as disengaging entirely, but it does mean putting relatively more emphasis on diplomatic tools and relatively less emphasis on the kind of military presence that we've built up since 9/11 over the course of the last 20 years. The last person to suggest that any of that is easy to do. It's amazing how much smarter we all get after we leave government. But I do think that recognizing that landscape is not the same as it was before is going to be really important. But being able to reassure people, both allies and partners and adversaries and everybody in between, is going to be a really important first step, because that's not what we're doing today.
Good pivot to the audience. And we haven't even talked about the coronavirus and how it's going to change the whole world. So we can do that too. Who is going to be first here? Here you go, right here. Yeah, go ahead. I think we have microphones, but this young man right here.
It's on its way to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just please, if you can, introduce yourself and try to make it a question so we can get as many as possible.
Hello, Tyler Combs, senior studying political science and Russian East European studies. We spoke at lunch. And my question is back to Russia. Mm-hmm. So it's become a very common thing to say that relations with Russia are at the worst they've been since the Cold War. But there's not nearly as much discussion over what can be done about it. Mm-hmm. So in your eyes, how should the United States move forward in regards to the Russia question? Should we pursue more engagement, or is that even an option at this point?
Well, I mean, I think it's a really good question. The honest answer, at least from my point of view, and I've gotten a lot of things about Russia wrong over the years, is that for the foreseeable future, in dealing with Vladimir Putin's Russia, which means the Russia that exists as long as he's living and breathing, because I don't think he's going to go away from being the central decision maker anytime soon, that we're going to be operating within a pretty narrow band, from the sharply competitive to the nastily adversarial. And I think we're going to be dealing with Putin's own combustible combination of grievance and ambition and insecurity, all wrapped up together. I don't mean to divert from your question, but I do remember vividly my first meeting with Putin as the newly arrived American ambassador in Russia. This is August of 2005. So it takes place in the Kremlin, which, as Susan knows very well, is a place that's built on a scale that's meant to intimidate visitors, especially newly arrived American ambassadors. So you walk down these long corridors through huge ornate halls. You come to the end of one huge ornate hall. There are these 2-story bronze doors. You're kept waiting there for a few minutes just to let all this sink in. Door cracks open, out comes Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, who, despite his bare-chested persona, is not all that intimidating in the flesh. He's about 5'6", even with lifts in his shoes. But he carries himself with great self-assurance. So he comes through the door. Before I got a word out of my mouth, he says in Russian, "You Americans need to listen more. You can't have everything your own way anymore. We can have effective relations, but not just on your terms." In my experience, that was vintage Vladimir Putin. It was not subtle. It was almost defiantly charmless. But the message was, he saw his mandate, as pushing back against what he saw to be an American effort to keep Russia down. He saw himself as the person who was going to reverse the chaos of Boris Yeltsin's Russia, which I had also served through in the 1990s. So that's the Vladimir Putin we have to deal with. Now, having said that we should assume pretty realistically that narrow band of possibilities, I'd add 2 things. First, you do need guardrails in that relationship. Russia is the only nuclear power in the world today comparable to the United States. The New START agreement, which regulates, reduces, monitors strategic nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia, is going to expire in less than 10 months. It's crazy, in my view, for us not to seek a simple extension of that agreement and use that as the foundation to begin to engage the Russians and ultimately the Chinese on bigger questions of nuclear arms control. The other thing I'd say, I guess there's 2 parts to it. One is, I think, for all of Putin's image as this grand strategist, I think history is actually going to be pretty harsh on Putin in terms of a lot of the strategic choices he's made. Domestically, rather than innovate and diversify the economy, which he could have done when I was ambassador a decade ago, he's surfing on $120 a barrel oil. That was the time to invest in human capital in Russia. He chose not to do that because it would have come at the expense of what matters most to him, which is political control. And so he's created a one-dimensional economy, which is good at muddling through, but unless oil prices go way up and stay way up, not much more than that. He swallowed up 2.5 million Crimeans beginning of 2014, but he's ensured that the other 42 million Ukrainians never again want to accept a predominant Russian influence over their choices. He's put a lot of eggs in the basket of partnership with Xi Jinping's China. I think if you look out a decade or more from now, Russians are going to chafe at being China's junior partner just as they chafed at being the junior partner of the United States, after the end of the Cold War. So if you look out far enough, there's probably room for artful American diplomacy, but in the foreseeable future, I think we need to be pretty realistic about it.
When someone tells you that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, you should listen to them, right?
Right, when Putin. Yeah, no. I mean, Putin has been pretty consistent in terms of the things he said that he wants to do, and I think it's a huge mistake not to pay attention to that.
Yeah. Okay, let's get some more before we go. Here, you. Mm-hmm.
I'll just stay sitting.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Katrin Cooney. I'm a freshman studying international studies, French and Arabic. And my question's kind of two parts. You'd mentioned Trump's sense of narcissism when dealing with foreign policy. Mm-hmm. How has that sense of narcissism come to fruition over the past 4 years? And what needs to be done to rebuild the relationships with allies that we've lost or strained relationships with allies and change foreign policy to accurately reflect the U.S.'s current role in the world instead of reflecting isolationist and nationalist ideals?
A really good question. I mean, first, don't get me wrong. I mean, personal relationships matter in foreign policy. Again, I go back to the example of President George H.W. Bush. He spent an inordinate amount of time building relationships with foreign leaders, so that matters. But to see that as the sole prism through which you see promoting American interests or relationships, especially if you're giving priority, as seems to be the case over the last few years, to authoritarian leaders, almost all of whom are strong men, rather than sort of democratically elected leaders, you're asking for trouble, it seems to me. So the short answer is, I think, we need to remind ourselves what our sources of strength are. A lot of them, of course, have to do with rebuilding, renewing, reinvigorating our own society, our economy, our ability to compete, the health of our democracy, trying not to eliminate polarization and political dysfunction overnight, but at least to chip away at it as well. Because we get a lot farther overseas through the power of our example than we do through the power of our preaching. And right now, that's not producing much for us overseas. Second, it does mean realizing that source of strength as we look out over the next decade or more really is going to depend on alliances and coalitions of countries and being able to help set rules, whether it's on trade or climate change or anything else. It doesn't mean a static view of those alliances, because they're, as we were just discussing, they're going to have to adapt to reflect new realities. It's going to mean paying attention to the big overarching global challenges, climate, the biggest existential threat out there, but also the revolution in technology. The need to begin to develop workable rules of the road that maximize the benefits and minimize the dislocations. That's a place where the United States ought to be exercising some leadership and working with, if not perfectly like-minded countries, at least countries that share a lot of the same instincts that we have as well. So, it's a pretty full and, in some ways intimidating agenda. But we do have a good hand to play today if we play it wisely.
You have to be an optimist to be a diplomat.
Right.
Go ahead.
I'm often reminded of one of the many typically fatalistic Russian definitions of an optimist, someone who thinks that tomorrow is going to be better than the day after. I actually think tomorrow is going to be really complicated, to go back to your question, but I think the day after holds some promise. Sorry.
It's okay. Go ahead. In the back there, yeah.
Hi, I also
Hi.
won't stand up.
No,
My
it's
name's
fine.
Rachel.
Hi.
I'm a sophomore studying international studies, French, econ, and religious studies, kind of all over the place.
No, I'm
so-
impressed with the range. Yeah, that's great.
Thank you. So my focus is actually Africa, and
Yes.
we don't see a lot of Africa in today's, politics and international community. But we see China coming up with their new Silk Road initiative, and we see them beginning to insert a lot of influence over the up and coming. Like Africa's going to have a lot more of our
Yes.
population. So what can the U.S. We've had a very negative approach towards Africa with the recent administration.
Yes.
So what kinds of things can we do to counteract China's initiative in Africa, if anything?
No, I think there's a lot we can do. I mean, it starts with paying attention, because the reality is that American administrations of both parties that I served, and I was guilty of this too in senior jobs in government, tend not to pay nearly as much attention to Africa and its evolution and its future as we ought to. You look at the reality that by the middle of this century, the 21st century, the population of Africa is going to double to 2 billion people from 1 billion people roughly today. So you play out into the future the problems of unresolved regional conflicts, of corrupt or poor governance, of food, water, health insecurity. The migration challenges that our European allies faced a few years ago are going to seem small by comparison to what you could face. So what it seems to me the United States ought to do in our own self-interest is, and given the limits of our resources, which aren't indefinite, is to invest in those leaderships and those societies which are actually demonstrating a commitment and getting a lot of things right. And they do exist in Africa today. You remember in the George W. Bush administration, what I think was one of the most historic advances made in that administration was the PEPFAR initiative to help deal with HIV/AIDS, not just in Africa, but primarily in Africa. And as a result, we're closer to the point of an AIDS-free generation than we've ever been before. But that meant providing significant resources, but working with leaderships and civil society activists that were getting it right and providing them that kind of support. And I think we can do the same thing in infrastructure and in power generation and other areas. The Chinese have invested a lot. They have a lot of capital to invest in Africa, but they're also not 10 feet tall in their approach. They tend not to generate much local employment. They tend to bring about a situation where governments are going to be heavily indebted, in some ways a very unhealthy economic way. So we can compete, but first you got to recognize the significance of Africa.
All right, we probably have time for about one more question. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Jack Nolan.
Hi.
I'm a senior majoring in international studies and Chinese.
Nice to see you.
First of all, thank you guys so much for coming out here. My question is, how much do you see this decline in the State Department as part of a broader trend of American presidents turning away from the State Department and relying more heavily on the National Security Council, the military, and the executive branch? Specifically, I think back to another great diplomat, the late Richard Holbrooke, how much success he had in the Balkans in the 90s under Bill Clinton. And you see sort of how he was cut out of the policy process under Obama in the Middle East.
It's a really good question. And the roots of this, as caustic as I've been about President Trump and the approach to foreign policy, the truth is that he didn't invent the drift in diplomacy. He's accelerated it and made it a lot worse. But you go back to the late Cold War period, American administrations of both parties cut the budget for diplomacy and development, State Department Agency for International Development, by about 50%, 5-0, between 1985 and 2000. Then came 9/11, a terrible jolt to our system, but a tendency to rely more and more on military and intelligence tools and to treat diplomacy as kind of an under-resourced afterthought as well. So this drift has been going on for a while. In the meantime, especially after 9/11, you had a National Security Council staff which got bigger and bigger. Now, some of that was quite logical. In the effort to fight terrorism after 9/11, the White House needed to play a much more hands-on coordinating role just because of the volume of activities, counter-terrorist activities that were going on. Same is true with regard to big emerging challenges like climate change and global economic issues, where that coordination function of the NSC staff required you to get a little bit bigger. I worked at the NSC staff in the last 3 years of the Reagan administration. We had about 60 professional staff members then. By the end of the Obama administration, it was well over 300. And I think I highlight that not because you didn't have a lot of really smart, dedicated people working at the NSC staff, some of whom are in this room, my former colleagues, but simply because you create an imbalance over time. And you bring out the passive-aggressive nature of the State Department sometimes, where people feel they're not in on the takeoff on issues, so they become less invested in the landing as well. And so, perversely in this administration, the size of the NSC staff has gotten much smaller. but I think the quality has also suffered considerably too. So I don't know what the right number is, but it's not over 300, but it's not 60 anymore either. And you need to have a balance where you have cabinet agencies like the State Department that's willing to take the initiative and take some risks. I would be the first person to acknowledge that while individual foreign service officers, career diplomats like Masha Jovanovic, whom you'll see tomorrow, are capable of being incredibly entrepreneurial and courageous and innovative. As an institution, the State Department is rarely accused of being too agile or too full of initiative. So, we have to be honest with ourselves. But you do need a better balance, is my only point. And I think that's one of the lessons that we ought to take home, not just from the experience of the last 3 years, but, of the preceding 20 years or so as well.
Well, I think that is an absolute masterclass in the problems and challenges facing us. Again, I would say to all of you who haven't had a chance, not only get the book, which I'm told is on sale here. See, I get to flack for your book. But, read the piece in Foreign Affairs. It's something really powerful. And, we'll all be arguing and debating kind of the politics of this moment for a long time. But I think often overlooked in that are the kinds of things that we're talking about today, which is, there will be real consequences one way or the other for America's role in the world. And when I want to know the answer, I look to Ambassador Burns. So I'm glad he shared this time with us. And thank you to all of you for sharing your time with us.
Thank you. That was great.